Hello, and welcome to Commendable Commotion. I'm Matthew Tanamelgi, and I'll be talking to some fascinating people about some equally fascinating topics that need more commotion. Continuing our look at the arts, I'll be talking to Conall Walsh about acting and comedy, particularly stand up comedy. Conall Walsh is an Irish actor and comedian who has recently moved to Toronto from Dublin. Conall is a seasoned stage actor, having trained at the Dublin Academy of Dramatic Arts and Bow Street Academy. Prominent performances include Richard in The Seafarer, Edmund in King Lear, and Justice Danforth in The Crucible. I acted alongside Conall during my undergrad, and he's got some great insights into performance, so everyone will want to listen closely to his story and to his advice for aspiring actors and comedians. Well, Conall, thank you. We go back a long way, so I'd like to ask you, you got a very interesting career, but just first, like when you were young, like when you were really young, how did you was acting and stand-up comedy and writing, was it something that you always wanted to do, or was it something that developed gradually?
Well, I'm very introspective, so I thought about this an awful lot. The acting, I think first came about, I was in the first play I was ever in, I think I was 4 or 5. And I can still remember the first line that I ever said on stage, which was I was in 101 Dalmatians, and I remember as well being in the acting class and insisting that I should play the funny one. So I guess there was like a bent towards comedy already, and my first line ever on stage was I could smell the croissants already. And I'm quite I definitely haven't embellished that with like the decaying of memory over time, but I like to think that I totally said that, and I'm impressed that as a 5-year-old I could pronounce croissant.
Quite an achievement.
But yeah, it was a very like light bulb moment, a very like formative moment, definitely, like finding acting, because I wasn't like, I wasn't shockingly bad at academics or anything, but I wasn't like excelling. It was the thing that I first found that sort of like I felt like I could set me apart in some way, maybe special. And then I tried to get in, and then I did acting like all throughout school. There was like a school play every year, and my mother tried to get me into some acting classes, and I remember she had a lot of trouble because almost all of the acting classes for like young people like under 12 tended to include dancing and singing, which was not my bag as a 6-year-old.
Just got out of embarrassment.
The craft extremely seriously.
Was that out of embarrassment or peer pressure, or was it just inherently not your thing?
Yeah, I've come to think about that. I don't know why. I don't know. I like to think that as a 6-year-old that singing and dancing didn't seem as dignified as speech, and because I think I may have come around to it in as an adult. Like at this point I would love to do a musical at some point, except that I can't dance at all, but I can't sing. But yeah, no, as a kid it was always like strictly no dancing, strictly no singing, and also then I was afraid of getting put in the chorus, just singing in the background. Oh, I think I might have realized what it was. As a young kid, my parents took me to the Panto every year. My uncle would always get us tickets to the Panto every Christmas at the Gaiety. So he went to the Panto every year, and as a 6-year-old who really wanted to be on stage, I so much resented the Billy Barry children. Which I don't know. Do you know the Billy Barry School?
I am sort of familiar with it. Who are they? For people who don't know them, who are they?
I mean, I don't know that much about it. Just that, like, that they were like the ones that supplied the kids for the Christmas pantos every year. And obviously, like, kids are limited in what they can do. So in terms of like how much they can work. So, but that may have been what caused my aversion to dancing and singing. And as I say, maybe a detriment, because I avoided that for a long time and now kind of regret it.
Okay. So yeah. So was there ever a sense of admiration though, somewhere in between that resentment when you saw people on
Oh,
stage in general?
oh yeah, for sure, yeah. Well, I always remember wanting to play a panto villain. This is still a dream of mine.
Yeah.
The sort of coming out onto the stage and being greeted by like boos from the entire audience, and sort of like it's a little like being a comedian, kind of. I mean, hopefully you're not met with boos, but in the sense that like panto villains would usually like interact with the crowd in terms of like, oh, shut up,
Yeah.
he's like ridiculing the hero, and the kids are all like, no, boo.
So
And
it
I like that
all
kind of confrontation with the audience thing.
so it all kind of fit in together then, like the acting and the stand-up comedy, it all kind of simultaneously kind of grew within you like that.
Well, not exactly stand up, because what I've learned more as I've gotten into stand up, is how much stand up is a very specific type of comedy. The comedy and humor are so broad, in terms of what they could apply to, or what could be called comedy. But stand up comedy is a very unique kind of thing. And going from acting to stand up, I've really got a sense of the difference between the relationship between the audience and the performer in a play versus in stand up. Because in stand up, the audience is far more of an active participant in what's happening. If an audience is half full for a play, there mightn't be as much energy in the room, and it might suck a bit of the energy and the excitement out of it. But if an audience is like half full for a stand-up show, it can easily ruin the entire thing. Because with stand-up, if it's not going well, there's a clear metric for it not going well, which is people are not laughing. If you're doing a play and people aren't gasping or crying, it doesn't necessarily mean the play is going bad. But if people aren't laughing at stand-up, it's going badly. It's like cut and dry, So, and everybody in the room is aware of that simultaneously. So when the stand-up, there's this real like tension in the air when the person gets on stage, and there's this sort of like, is this going to go well? Is this going to, because they're just, there's no pizzazz, there's no like background, there's no interesting costumes usually, or props. It's just a person with a microphone talking. And which is also like, that tension is also what makes it so amazing when it goes really well.
Yeah. Interesting, yeah. So it can be a bit, it's a slippery slope between it being like intensely awkward or intensely funny.
Yeah. And that built up tension is what makes it so good when, a joke like lands and there's an explosion of laughter.
Are there any sort of particular, comedic shows or, comedians themselves that particularly inspire you, or even like shows specifically where you can think, or, on TV that you saw or anything like that, where, you kind of, they stick in your mind, or just individuals who'd inspire you in comedy?
I think undoubtedly like The Simpsons, just like from ages like 4 to like 20, that was like my comedy Bible.
The Simpsons.
Yeah, The Simpsons.
Yeah.
I mean, the good Simpsons, like the season 2 to season 9. But in terms of like the quality of joke writing and like the amount of jokes crammed into every episode, I feel like I got a lot of my like comic sensibilities from watching The Simpsons. But then again, like I said, it's not it getting into stand up. I realized how much stand up is its own very specific thing when it comes to comedy, because and that's kind of held me back in ways, because stand up, that tension that you're working with makes everything so in the moment, and also because most of people's experience of stand up is watching pre-recorded hour-long specials that some of the most famous comedians in the world are producing, which is not, you're not really getting a sense of what stand-up is like, because it is about the fact that it's live and that it could go horribly wrong. You're watching a stand-up set that's pre-recorded. They're obviously going to pick one that went well. They're not going to pick one where they bombed horribly. So you lose that tension. And because of that, the joke construction and like how the quality, the depth of the jokes are not the most important thing when it comes to live stand-up, usually, because also, like, me performing stand-up, I'm performing stand-up to people who have no idea who I am, who have no context for me at all except what I tell them in those 10 minutes, which is totally different from I don't know, Dave Chappelle or someone who gets up in front of a crowd of 2,000 people who've paid €100+ to go see him, who know him, who really like him. He could come out and he could just make a face, and they're like, that's, I know what Dave's thinking about. But it's a totally different context to a stranger coming up in front of a group of people who have just been like, oh, we go out and see some comedy tonight. So you have to kind of, and when you're, if you have built up an audience, which is what I would like to do, like a niche audience, like people that will allow you to get more in depth with the things that you're talking about and make more like interesting jokes, more complex jokes. But that is quite different from the comedian who has the ability to come up in front of anyone. And even though they might not have the most, groundbreaking comedy, they're so good at making an audience comfortable and immediately understand who they are and where they're coming from, that is like a real skill in and of itself.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah, that's it's a skill that maybe can't be learned very easily, would you say? Or can be? What do you think?
I'd say it needs to be learned through years and years of experience.
Right.
That's one thing. In comedy, you very, very rarely find a comedian that gets successful who hasn't spent nearly a decade doing comedy. Whereas, like, you would get actors who, their uncle is a producer or something, so they get in a huge movie the first time they're in a movie. Or even just like an actor gets a lucky break because someone sees them and it's like, I want to put them in this movie. Comedian, you really have to like prove yourself again and again, because people want that. If they're booking your show, they want that reliability. They want to know this person goes up and 90% of the time, nearly 100% of the time, the audience is going to love them. They don't want that gamble of like, well, I like their comedy, but I don't know if this would translate to the average audience.
Right. Okay. So there's quite a business element to it then as well, for the organizers, for the players as such.
For sure. Yeah.
Yeah. I see. Okay, it's interesting. Yeah, because I mean, obviously, like audience members, they sometimes some of them would think about that, like in terms of, what goes on behind the scenes. Some wouldn't, I suppose. It's an easy
Mm.
thing to forget. So, do you think it's like do you think it's how would I put it? Do you think it's a risky business at all? Like, do you think it's one that you'd be a bit intimidated by initially, or were intimidated by initially, that whole
Oh,
business side of
oh,
it?
for sure. I mean, well, just doing stand up, beginning to do stand up, I would think you're kind of crazy if you're not intimidated by it.
Yeah.
Because that's the other thing about the difference between stand up and acting is there's much less of a clear distinction between the person on stage and the real person. You know, in acting, you're almost always playing a character, but when you're on stage doing stand up, you're usually playing like an exaggerated version of yourself. Which and it means that if people are not laughing, and also because you have that cut and dry, it's going bad if people are not laughing, it's going well if people are laughing. If they're not laughing, it feels a little like they're rejecting you as a person, as opposed to, oh, they just don't like this play.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. I see. So that would be emotionally, like that'd be kind of tough going through that, like, over and over again potentially.
Yes. I mean, thankfully, I don't bomb that often,
No.
but
No.
but
Just in
it
general,
happens. That's
people
another
in
thing is that
general.
it happens. It does happen, and it happens to like almost every comedian, even like seasoned comedians. There's as I said, like almost every comedian who's like who you've heard of, who's big, has been doing it for at least a decade, and all of them have bombed horribly. You know, there's no. I mean, I guess you could say most actors have been in a bad production, but it doesn't feel as much like it's reflective on them, because you could say, well, it was a bad movie or director was bad, but every single successful comedian has had that thing, and it makes you, in the moment, it makes you question, like, you could be a successful comedian even, and this happens. So there's an interesting documentary called I think it's just called The Comedian, where Jerry Seinfeld, after Seinfeld the show ended and he hadn't been doing stand up for like 7-10 years or something, he got back into stand up, and you see him struggling to like get across new jokes, to do bits that he hasn't tried before, which is like humbling, and like to see someone who's considered like one of the greatest comedians of all time still struggling to give like new material, that it never becomes easy.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's interesting. So, what's the name of that documentary? The Comedian, is it?
I think it's just called The Comedian. Yeah, it's on Netflix.
Okay. Yeah. No, that sounds interesting, because I mean, stand-up comedy in general isn't really a realm that I'm hugely familiar with, but a lot of people are. So,
Mm-hmm.
I would like to know.
But I think, okay, a
Go
lot
ahead.
of people are, but a lot of people are, but have never actually gone to see comedy live.
Yeah. Yeah.
And like I said, I think you're missing the real stand up experience if you haven't seen it live.
Yeah, no, I'd say so. I mean, and they say the same with acting in general. Some people do
Oh yeah, if you've
anyway.
ever watched a recording of a play, like it could be the greatest actors ever. It just looks flat and awful.
Yeah, yeah, no, that can happen sometimes, definitely. And it's interesting seeing, how digital technology you know, can enhance performance. So it's not like all, recorded plays are bad or that kind of thing. It's not the case at all. But sometimes you
Mm-hmm.
can find that effect that you mentioned. Definitely depends on the show. But in terms of, I'd be interested in knowing. You said that stand-up comedy, you're kind of, being an exaggerated version of yourself. So I'd be interested in knowing, like, when you do stand-up comedy, what are those qualities, like, if you could identify any that you're exaggerating for an audience of yourself, what are those qualities? It'd be interesting to know.
I think I often like exaggerate like my own cynicism. Like I'm sort of like satirizing like how cynical I am, um, which is sounds kind of weird. Uh, Well, one thing is that I don't really write stand up about like things that have literally happened to
Yeah.
me. Which a lot of people do. Well, a lot of people will write stand up about things that happen to them, and then they'll like totally exaggerate the story and make it more funny and embellish it a lot. Uh, Whereas I'm trying to think of like any of my bits that are, I don't think I have any bits that are literally about things that have happened to me in my real life. Like occasionally it'll be like I'll start with a little story about something that happened to me, but what I'm saying is actually to make like, it's not about the actual story. It's about like some point that I then get onto. And I think a lot of the comedy that I do, like it comes out of like the difference between uh the sort of hypocrisies and like the the paradoxes about how we like speak, like just people in general, like how we, the way that we say we ought to act, and you know our idealized idea of ourselves, and the complete juxtaposition of how we actually are, which is always, you know, not as we say we are. um yeah, well, I think a lot of it, I have it, when I was in UCD, I studied psychology, and I don't write stuff like with a mind to, oh, I'm going to go into this psychological thing. But I realized that a lot of it, reflecting back on what I've written, is kind of about that. You know, like things like confirmation bias. You know how, you know, we simultaneously think things like, you know, I'm absolutely certain about something, but at the same time, I realize that my personal certainty uh, is no proof that something is correct, and yet I still feel certain about the thing.
So that's something that goes quite well into comedy, or is it?
Well, this is the other thing, is that it's kind of like, my fear is sometimes that there's always like a battle of like, I read John Cleese's autobiography, and he talked about this, was never trying to be clever, always prioritizing being funny. And I think this is a thing that happens in a lot of modern comedy, is and it, you know, I find it in my own writing as well, is I'm writing and I realize, like, this is, I'm just making some point, you know, the primary function of this is to make a point. It's not to be funny. And there's an interesting like fine line that you have to find, because people don't want to feel like they're just being lectured to. But that's the kind of thing that allows, you can say some very interesting things through comedy that people will listen to because it's comedic, that if you just told them it's straight, they would be turned off because you're just lecturing. But telling them and making a serious point through humor, it kind of allows you, people will give you that allowance to do that if they don't realize that they're being lectured to. You
Yeah,
know,
yeah.
that kind of like laughter where you're laughing and then you're like, that is so true.
Yeah, no, that's definitely a good way of describing it, definitely, because it's interesting, because like that falls into so many other creative walks of life. I mean, for someone making a horror film where maybe there's a deeper message, same general method, you know,
Yeah,
for a screenwriter,
for
or
storytelling as well. Like I've heard that for like writing a short story or a novel. Like you don't want to go into the writing process being like, okay, what's the point I have to make here? You want to go in saying, I have this interesting story to tell, and those points will come out of it. But if it feels like you're constructing it so purposefully to make a point, I think the audience or the reader like catches on to that, and they don't like that. You know, they could go out and read a pamphlet or listen to a politician or read philosophy if they wanted that, but they're reading it to be entertained. And that kind of, you know, someone I've heard Do you know Norm Macdonald?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Died just before I came over here,
Yeah.
Canadian hero. But he made the point that a lot of people say that comedians are modern day philosophers, which I think is kind of insulting to modern day philosophers, who actually exist. But I think there's something to be said about that, where people are far more willing to grapple with a serious point if it's conveyed to them through comedy.
Yeah, that's a good point, definitely. And like you mentioned, the importance of having the story and then the points coming out of it. I suppose, would you say you can have both simultaneously? Like, say, a writer's like, okay, interesting story. It fits well with some points I or whoever feels. So this will be good. Let's go with that. So it's not like they come out of the story. It's more like they go simultaneously, and that sort of balance between entertainment and deeper stuff, for want of a better word, kind of is what makes it click. Is that kind of what you mean as well, or what you'd agree with?
Yes, I would. There's a sweet spot where, like, I mean, you could go completely silly with comedy, and that's also like, has its merits and is very funny. And you can also be far more of a political comedian. Like, there is an audience for that. There is people. You have this phenomenon now of what is it called? Clapter. Have you ever heard the term clapter?
No.
It's like, if you ever watch like a lot of like American late night TV shows where they come out and they do their monologue about like modern politics, and they like rib on whoever the punching bag of the moment is, and when they make their point, the audience is clapping like, yes, I agree with you. They're not laughing.
Yeah.
There's a type of laughter that's like, yes, and then there's like the like uncontrollable, like what I would call like real laughter, where you're like, you can't help yourself. You're not like forcing it in any way.
Yeah, I see what you mean. So it's kind of it's a realm that's kind of if you're not careful, can be infiltrated as such, by other motives,
Mm-hmm.
political or otherwise. Interesting. So, like in terms of then, so from what it sounds like, you understand the importance of entertainment as being entertainment, or entertainment being a vehicle or kind of thing to express your personal feelings and ideas. You understand that distinction between that and then the more kind of preachy kind of stuff. So you have a good understanding of that from what it sounds like, which is good to see. And I suppose, what individuals would inspire you? Comedians or otherwise, actors or otherwise, psychologists or otherwise, philosophers or other. I mean, who knows? What will be who would be your inspirations? You mentioned The Simpsons earlier, but who, if any at all?
I really like Chris Morris, who I'm devastated doesn't make more stuff. Do you know who he is?
I wish I did. I'm not very familiar. Who's Chris Morris?
So he is I suppose, a satirist mainly. He's not a comedian in terms of a stand-up comedian. But have you ever heard of The Day Today or Brass Eye?
Oh, I vaguely heard of them. So he's a satirist, not necessarily a comedian then.
Yeah, I mean, extremely, extremely funny. Today Today is like a sort of parody of news from the 90s that was on Channel 4, and then the Brass Eye is like a parody of like panorama style shows where they take like an in-depth look at a certain topic. And he has this like incredible like dry delivery that is just so pitch perfect. Where as a kid, I couldn't tell when he was being serious or not. And also, like, I love the fact that he's someone who could be, and Norm Macdonald is a bit like this as well. Like, he could be, and Stuart Lee, who I'm also a huge fan of, where he could be performing to an audience, and a lot of people in the audience would not understand what's funny. That he doesn't like bring attention to the fact that he's joking. It's so like you just have to get it, and if once you get it, like, and the fact that other people don't get it makes it even funnier. And it's hard to explain. He did a movie called Four Lions, which is about a bunch of jihadi terrorists in the UK in like 2005 who are kind of like wannabes, and they're really like bad at it. So like they're trying to do like one of those like those videos where he's holding like the AK-47, but they don't have like a real one. They have like a toy one that's really small. So he tries to like hold it close to the camera to make it look larger, and then like go away from it like that. It's a great movie.
What's the name of the movie?
Four Lions.
Four Lions.
Yeah, as in lions like the animal.
Yeah. Not four lines, like, okay.
No,
yeah.
not four lines, like
Okay.
cocaine.
Well, that's yeah, it sounds a bit similar to the old Sacha Baron Cohen stuff that he used to do back in like the early 2000s. When was that
it
movie?
Does involve a bit of that. There's a bit of like that, like street skit style stuff. But the thing with him is he's so believable as like a newsman that he just gets people to say the most bizarre things. He just asks them questions. Is what I always remember. He's like, yeah, and what is the letter of the law? And he puts the mic in the guy's face and he goes, J.
Okay. Well, I'm liking the sound of this guy. I'm not too familiar with them. I know I should be, but as I said, comedy or satire, the whole general umbrella, for want of a better word, is a realm I'm not too familiar with. Maybe it's because I'm too serious. I don't know. But, you know,
right.
Something that someone said, actually two people I spoke to a long time ago said, was that good comedians are never normal people. And I don't know exactly what that means. But I think, and this was when I was in school, like, you know how people, you know what people say in school. But it's just one of those things where I think the point they were making was that clever people are never normal people. So good comedians who, you know, usually I suppose are clever, aren't normal people. Would you agree or disagree with that? Because I know it's a pretty big stereotype to make, but it was just interesting. Whenever I think about comedy, I do think about what those two kids in school, when I was, you know, doing my exams or whatever, what they said. And it goes through my head even today, all these years later. So what do you make of that idea?
Yes, it's interesting. I mean, I suppose it requires, to some extent, like seeing the world in a different way, but not necessarily that you're like, you know, seeing the world in a different way could mean like you're, you know, you've lost your mind completely. I think it's a kind of like, almost like having a little window into like that kind of thing, but, you know, still being able to function as a person. Although a lot of comedians are not the most functional people, although that also goes for like most entertainers. You know, an awful lot of comedians are bullied or were bullied as kids, and comedy becomes a kind of like defense mechanism. You know, it's a way to endear yourself to people. And the other thing about it is that it's a way to get people to like you where there isn't an ambiguity. Because like I said about that cut and dry, they're laughing or they're not. You know, if you do something kind for someone, you know, they could seem genuinely pleased by it, but there's always going to be a bit of like, well, you know, did they just make a nice face? Did they just seem pleased? But if you get someone laughing, you genuinely know that you're affecting them.
Yeah. So that lack of ambiguity can kind of be reassuring to some people. And I suppose, yeah, there'd be insecurity could factor into that, I suppose. So What about people who would maybe take the opposite route sometimes of maybe actually almost trying to shock people and not in a particularly funny way? Well, I suppose it could be funny as well. Like you might have comedians like that. What about people who take the opposite route of actually, like you mentioned, you were interested in writing as well. People who maybe try to make something that's so blisteringly angry or negative that it actually might shock people. It's a similar kind of route in some ways.
Yeah, right. I think that's interesting. It's interesting you say anger because like I see that a lot over here. Like over here, I'm going to so many open mics. I'm seeing some, and anyone can do those. So I'm seeing some bizarre stuff, and sometimes like it just comes across as like pure rage, like inner anger, and there's nothing funny about it, and it's not being presented as though it's supposed to be funny. And this is another thing about like, for me, at the end of the day, like it's supposed to be entertainment. I like some people here seem to use stand-up comedy as like a form of therapy, and they just talk about like how they're feeling in everyday life. And a lot of the time I'm like, well, what is the joke? You're supposed to be doing stand-up comedy, not just whining to people about what's going on in your life. Obviously, definitely not a good format for therapy. I mean, I feel the same way about people who use social media for therapy.
Yeah, yeah. Is
Um,
there an element of narcissism for some of them? For some of them?
uh, oh yeah, yeah, for sure. I mean, there's that moment when you like, a lot of stand-up comedy can be like, I have this weird, feeling, this weird thought that seems to go against like what we say is socially acceptable or how we should feel, and you present that hoping that everyone is going to be like, oh, he's right, I feel that way too, and I can't say it, and that's the release of energy and laughter that comes out of that. But sometimes people will come up and they'll present this thing, don't you ever feel like this, and everyone is just looking at them like perplexed, like, no, and they've had this moment of being like, I'm going to open myself up to people, and they're going to get it. Because some people will, you can have two reactions to that. You can say like, oh, maybe this is kind of an idiosyncratic thought, and maybe I really need to look at this. Or you can go like, what? These people are wrong, don't they? Everyone should feel like I feel, and then like the anger comes out.
And some of that would happen publicly, like right in front of an audience, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes people have a reaction of like their joke doesn't go well, and they don't laugh it off, or they don't just move on to the next joke. They like get visibly angry with the audience for not understanding, which is never going to endear the audience to you. That's not going to get them back on your side.
Yeah, but in its own way, that would probably be kind of entertaining now and then to see, wouldn't it?
In retrospect, it's entertaining. In the moment, it's very uncomfortable.
Yeah, probably would be a bit uncomfortable in the moment. Yeah, I see what you mean. Well, in terms of like, stuff you've done and stuff you aim to do in the future, near future, etc., I'd love to hear a bit more about that. So, any projects in particular that stand out to you, any festivals in particular that stand out to you over the years? I know you've done quite a lot. So,
well, I did the Edinburgh Fringe in 2019, and I'm not doing it this year. It's just so expensive to fly back, and then the festival itself is incredibly expensive. But I think I'm going to make an aim to do that again in 2023. And there's a few. Is my mic still working?
Yeah, seems to be. Can you hear me?
Oh, right. It's just one of my earphones ran out of battery. I wasn't sure if the whole thing was still working.
It's all good. Perfect. It's all right.
Yeah, there's a few. There's the Montreal Just for Laughs festival. There's apparently a load of fringes over here. I need to look into more. I'm getting into. I've decided to get more serious about social media, which is something I've neglected for a long time because I found myself like not addicted to social media, and the whole conversation around social media is that people are like desperate to get off it, and I'm like, why do I want to get into this thing that everyone is so? But in terms of self promotion, like it's unparalleled. You don't need any sort of industry behind you. You don't need contacts. You just need to have to look at how to market yourself on social media. And I think to have that barrier between like the social media me is the comedian and then I'm just myself, is to focus on social media purely as a job thing, as a marketing thing. So I'm trying to right now set up a plan to like film sets and film some like one-man sketches that I would like try to release, get like a semi-consistent release schedule, and try to build up an audience on social media.
Well, that sounds
because
like
I'm also
plan, yeah.
I'm so bad at the schmoozing. Like the way to get yourself ingratiated into the stand-up is to into the scene is to like hang out with everyone, is to talk to the right people, and then when you get on their good side to go, well, can you hand me a spot? And then you like slowly, which I hate the idea that I would start interacting with someone, because I know that they book a certain gig. It seems so unnatural and like, but it's the nature of the beast, so I have to get over that really. But the internet is also a way where you can get yourself known by these people, and you get yourself out there without having to, slide over to someone and interrupt their conversation and go, how are you doing? And
Yeah, it's I see what you mean. So it's one of those things that despite some of despite its ugly side, it can still be pretty useful. And in terms of like,
yeah, I mean, it's
yeah. Aha, internet connection is unstable, it says.
Yes, I see that you're fairly jittery there.
Yeah, is it working now for you?
It is, yeah.
Cool. What were you saying? Sorry, before we got cut off.
I can't remember.
Oh, it's all right. Well, it was just kind of interesting because, like, with social media, it's like one of those things where there's an ugly side to it, but there's also this extremely or potentially extremely useful side to it. I suppose it depends on who's using it.
Yes, there's nuance to it. It's good and bad points.
Yeah, and in terms of
but it is also the reality of the modern world. So
yeah, that's that's a good point. Yeah. And so, like, let's say then, was there ever a period in your, comedic work where you were like really tempted to have like a strong point? Because you mentioned earlier about, the need to not fall down that rabbit hole of actually getting distracted from the, from entertaining an audience while making a point. Was there ever like maybe a point earlier in your career, anything at all, that you kind of like really wanted to get some, social, political, whatever point across, just personal, emotional point, and you tried making it entertaining, but you just kept getting tugged back by the point itself? Is that, was that ever a problem you had? Because some people do problems with that, whether it's in comedy or serious writing or a bit of both. Do you relate to that?
Mm-hmm. Oh, I totally relate to that. I mean, I think what I would often do is like I'll start writing something and then I'll be like, no, this is just turning into like a point. There aren't jokes. And I think the way to deal with that is not to like completely abandon it. It's how do I structure this as a stand-up set and get it across while prioritizing making jokes? Because, and if you have, like I said, with the audience that is there to see you specifically, that would be in terms of stand-up, my eventual goal is to like not be like the huge comedian, but to have like a dedicated niche audience that like my comedy specifically. Because I find that like a lot when I do shows and they go well, is like for a few people in the audience, they like really like my stuff, and like, you know, other people might not get it, or might just think, oh, that's weird and different. But I have noticed that where there is like a subsection of the audience that really likes my stuff, and I really like that, because that's the kind of thing that because all the comedians that I like, Stuart Lee and Norm Macdonald, they're the kind of people who, if you just threw them up on a random stage in front of strangers for 15 minutes, their style of comedy is so unlike the average stand-up that they could easily bomb. People would not necessarily get, but like people who know what they're about and what they're like are able to get so much more out of it than just the like 15 minutes in front of strangers things. And that's what I would like to eventually build to.
Yeah. And how would you recommend, you know, starting that journey and continuing that journey for people who, you know, would be interested in, you know, stand-up comedy and becoming comedians themselves? What point are you at on that ladder as such? What point are you at, and how would you continue it? What advice would you give for people for that?
Well, I mean, I've gone down the ladder a bit, because I was running my own club in Dublin, the Crackdown, which has gone off to huge success in my absence. It's no coincidence. But it just got a show on TV3 on Virgin Media. But so I had been doing that like weekly before COVID, so it meant that I had like a proper like 12-minute set in a club with invited people, as opposed to just open mics where the audience is largely made up of comedians who aren't really paying attention and will leave after their set. Whereas over here, I'm doing all like mainly open mics, and then every like month or so I get like 1 or 2 gigs, which hopefully will increase. But the open mics over here are way better, because a lot of them actually have audiences because they're free.
Yeah, I see
what was the question again?
Oh, well, you know, just
what's the advice?
Yeah, for, you know, being on, you know, career ladder as such.
I think accept the fact that it's a long journey, and that like it can take a while to get good. And try to do it as much as possible, because a huge part of like what makes you a good comedian is just being confident on stage. Like that's the one thing that will turn an audience off immediately if you look uncomfortable, which obviously you are for a certain period of time going to look uncomfortable when you're doing it, because you're not used to doing it. But once you get very used to being on stage, that was a huge shift for me, because I was doing acting in plays for so long that I had lost any sense of stage fright. Like I was excited to go out on stage. I wasn't like nervous. But when I started doing stand-up, it was like jitters before the show started. It was a total shift. But now, after I'm probably like 2 years into it, that like it's pretty much completely gone. Except if I do a new bit and it's not going well, that's when the nerves start again. But there's a few places in Dublin that do, and probably in other cities that do like that hand out spots for like complete newcomers, like for their first few times. So as that's a great way to start, because it's going to get you up in front of an actual audience, as opposed to just doing open mics, which are usually not great audiences.
Yeah, I see what you mean. And in terms of, let's say, acting, you know, just irrespective of comedy, you know, sometimes, what advice would you give to people who are looking to get into acting, whether it's plays, whether it's films, television, etc.? What advice would you have for people wanting to do that?
I think constantly like keeping yourself, I mean, this is advice for myself as much as it is for other people, but like constantly keeping yourself active and reminding yourself like why you love it and why you do it. Because I think like with acting, for most actors, there's huge spaces of nothing between the performances. You know, it's like waiting for the phone to ring, or I guess waiting for the email or whatever. So there's going to be these long periods of time where you're not acting at all. And in those times, like there can be like a lingering doubt that like grows within you, like why am I even doing this? You know, do I even love this anymore? But then you do it, and immediately like, oh, now I realize why I'm doing it. You know, I do love this. So like I think doing classes or like filming things with your friends, like something that you don't need, even filming things on your own, you know, just to remind yourself that you can do this and you like doing this, and just because you're not currently cast in some movie or some play, you know, that doesn't mean you cease to be an actor.
Yeah, yeah. And in terms of then like let's see. You were in a play recently, I know, and it was great to see. What would you be able to tell us a bit about that? Like, I mean, what was that experience like, and how did you get
Oh yeah.
involved and that kind of thing?
So like I was saying, that I got involved not just through like an open casting call that I found online. It's for Stones in His Pockets, which is an Irish play with two actors playing like I think 13 characters. So it was just the two of us on stage. It was it's the most lines I've ever had in a play. Like the only time I've been in a play where I'd never leave the stage for an hour and a half. It was very sweaty work. And it's an Irish play. And it interestingly had a lot of parallels to my own life. I don't know if it's just because I'm like older and more mature, but I feel like I had never related so much to a character in a play, and like really understood the emotions that he was feeling, because it's about two two guys in like a small town in Kerry who get cast as extras in a huge like Hollywood film, and it's like sort of a play on what's that Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman one. But it's like at the time there was a bunch of American movies being made in Ireland, sort of using Ireland as this romantic backdrop. You know, the fields and the beautiful cliffs and things. But everyone involved was American, and it was like a very American style story about like, you know, true love and like, yeah, I don't know, the pursuit of happiness and all that. Which is quite different from the Irish perspective on life. And it kind of played on that, like these are two characters who have grown up watching American movies and like seeing America all the time. And the character that I played was a guy who had moved to America, who had lived there, and then had moved back. So he kind of didn't find his like success in America, and he's kind of like torn up about that and kind of resentful of that, like dreaming about things and like that's just some American nonsense. And eventually sort of comes to realize that like there's great value in, you know, the telling of the story that's like real, like how like the American movie that's shot in Ireland says nothing about what it's like to live there. You know, it's not genuine, it's not their story.
And was it written like, I mean, so like what's the history of this play, in particular Stones in His Pocket? So that's
I
a
think it was originally released in like 98, and then it was re-released in 2001 by Marie Jones. It was very successful when it was released. It was nominated for a Tony when it did Broadway.
Very good,
I think there's a film version of it as well. The guy who plays Varys in Game of Thrones, it's one of the leads.
Right.
Although I don't know how it would work as a movie, because a big part of the play is that it's two actors switching between all these characters.
Yeah, and that's
which is something I love. Like I love that the suspension of disbelief that you can get away with in theater is like incredible. Like at first people are a bit like, what's going on here? Who's who? And I don't understand it. But like 20 minutes into it, people are totally invested in, oh, now it's this character. And they start to get like excited when they see the new character enter, even though they know it's just two people. But they've forgotten about that and they're totally like invested in what's going on.
Well, it's a fascinating idea, I mean, that's that would have been really interesting to see. So I'm pleased to hear about that. And so what are you what exactly would draw you to a project? That's a thing I'd like to
if they'll put me in it.
What's that?
If they'll put me in it.
Okay, well, apart from that as well.
If I had a slew of options open to me, I mean, I like comedy a lot. I think, comedy and acting is like, comedic acting is where my two like passions kind of meet in the middle. And in Dramstock, that was my go-to, was doing all the comedic acting stuff, which, I like that because you're making people laugh, but at the same time, it's not as vulnerable as stand-up comedy because you are playing characters, and it's not as in the moment. Like that's one thing about stand-up, is you need to know how to sort of ride the laugh. Because it's all, stand-up is delivered as though it's not pre-written, but it obviously is pre-written. And so if you get a huge laugh on one of your bits, like halfway through a bit, but then you just keep going and you don't react you don't take a pause to let them laugh, then they miss what you're saying next. And also it looks pre-rehearsed. But with a comedic play, you don't have that nearly as much. And actually that could be an issue with comedic plays, is that people are afraid to laugh because it's considered like rude to make noise as a theater audience. So you usually need like a few people to break the tension, a few good laughers, and then eventually you'll get everyone.
Yeah, they call that sometimes in plays with comedic elements or something like that. They sometimes call, like, let's say an actor laughs at their own line or laughs at, an audience's reaction.
Oh, yeah.
They call that corpsing sometimes in drama training. Corpsing. I don't know quite why they call it that. I suppose.
Yeah, why is that? I've never actually.
Maybe it's because it could be because, I don't know, like as far as the audience is concerned, the character is dead. It's basically become a real person again. So that's a weird take on it.
It very often though, anytime I've actually seen corpsing on stage, it's usually been in a context where it works. Yeah. Like where the play is such a silly play already that, like, I saw Spamalot in the Board Gosh, and I think Phil Jupitus was King Arthur, and at one point he just like broke into laughter, but it was like after the audience had already been laughing for a good 10 seconds, and he just like couldn't hold it back. So, and because of the context of that being, a Monty Python play, no one's going to be like, well, this ruins the seriousness of what they're doing here. But certainly, if you're laughing and it's not like a hilariously funny scene, it's so obvious that you're taken out of the scene. No corpsing in the show, thankfully.
And one thing that was kind of interesting was I was listening to a podcast about the life and career and death of Robin Williams, and they mentioned that sometimes with comedians there can be a bit of a trap that or a bit of a, how should I put it, a label that can be put on them sometimes, particularly when they're deceased, where they kind of get labeled as the sad clown, that kind of thing. And actually, no, sometimes it's more complex than that. It's not quite, oh, well, such and such a comedian was depressed and etc. So What do you? I mean, like, do you think there's a danger of those labels kind of being put on actors and comedians as, like, whether it's typecasting, whether it's them as a person? I mean, what's your opinion on that?
Well, I always found Rob Williams specifically, like whenever he's in interviews, he he seems like to be always under the pressure that he always needs to be on. Like he never kind of like lays back and be like, I'll let someone else, do the funny stuff now. He always, at least to me, always came across in interviews like he always needed to be the guy doing the thing. And I don't think that's necessary. I think that might be something that like a lot of comedic people struggle with, of like, well, if people find and are amused by what I'm doing, I guess I won't stop doing it because they like it all the time, right? I've got to be loved by people. But I don't necessarily think that like all comedians are in a state of horrible, depression by default. Certainly, it can be it's very easy to become an alcoholic as a comedian because you're always performing in bars, always late at night. Very easy to have 2 or 3 drinks every night, and then if the show goes well, to have more with the comedians afterwards, and drugs as well. But yeah, it's an interesting. People like to talk about like tragedy and comedy being like 2 sides of the same coin. But there's plenty of horribly depressed people who are not remotely funny. So
Yeah, okay, yeah. So yeah, no, it's a complex issue, but it was just one that was interesting to raise because I know that sometimes it can be a thought that crosses people's mind. Then when you read more about a particular individual or situation, it's like, okay.
Well, I suppose it's the shock that like it seems so counter to like what Robin Williams' like public image was. It was like this seemed like the most joyful. I mean, he was like so in terms of like exuding joy, almost unparalleled as an entertainer. To think that that guy was like miserable on the inside seems so unbelievable.
Yeah,
that people are shocked by that. And then I guess they're like, well, I guess if he was like that, then everyone who's really joyful, outwardly, they must really be depressed. And I feel like they're like exaggerating how common that is just because of how shocking it is. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and there was the whole issue though as well of the what's the name of the type of was it Lewy body dementia that Robin Williams had, and so there was
I sort of yeah, and of course that gets thrown out the window because people in the public didn't know about that.
Right.
And you also got like the aspect of like him being a very famous, known person. But obviously, we didn't really know him. We didn't know him like his family knew him.
Yeah, exactly. So it's such a complex issue when it gets kind of brought up in the media or in public conversations sometimes about like, what are comedians really like, that kind of thing, or what was going on in their lives, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and there's always an interest in media to make it a narrative, to make it like it can't be just one tragic event that happens. Like this must reveal something about society in some way.
Yeah, and sometimes it can go overboard, definitely. I see what you mean. Yeah, that's narrative. I mean, I suppose narrative is such a important part of many creative works. Then when it starts leaking into, let's say, people's lives, it can sometimes become a bit dangerous.
For sure.
But in terms of then, before we finish up, anything else you'd like to leave us with? Like any advice you have for aspiring actors, comedians, writers, etc. Anything at all? Interesting anecdotes, advice for people who want to do what you do. What advice would you have to finish up?
Like keep yourself active. I think, I mean, COVID obviously was like a huge hit for everyone. It was like I missed performing so much, and felt kind of like I got really into like the gym and weightlifting since when COVID started, and I think that was like, it was definitely all this like energy that I had that I needed to like exert somewhere, and then it was I was so desperate to get back to it, and it felt so good to get back to it. But yeah, keeping yourself active, like reminding yourself constantly why you're doing this, because like, I'm not making a career out of this yet. I mean, that's always the hope, but there's always that, well, it hasn't happened yet, so maybe it's time to throw in the towel. But then I do it, I do a stand-up set that goes really well, or I do a play, and I'm totally reminded of why I'm doing it. So I think you need to keep yourself active for that constant, reassuring yourself.
Yeah, no, that's good advice, definitely, because I know that just sometimes with anything creative, it can just take absolutely ages before, the big moment.
And that's also within your own power.
It is. In what way specifically would you be able to expand on how that's within your own power? Because it'd be interesting to know.
Well, because like you don't need to be waiting on someone else to, give you the opportunity. You have to like go out and seek them yourself, but also just to like, even if you don't have the opportunity to be doing, I don't know, like if I can't get onto a good stand-up show night, that doesn't mean I stop doing open mics. I'm constantly, if I just didn't do anything and waited for the big show to come along, then eventually I would just like lose motivation. But the constant doing things and, not relying on other people to like give you opportunities to like, to perform, to create opportunities for yourself to perform and be creative, I think is important. And also like classes will help a lot with that. And that is another way to get other people involved.
Yeah, and they can be very useful, certainly. Like there's some things that just tend to stick with you after doing classes, particularly if it's for a very long time. Acting classes, that kind of thing. Some of the stuff really sticks with you and can be helpful in all sorts of contexts, And
I think there's a certain like, for me anyway, there's a certain like, artist mentality of like, you can't possibly teach me how to make art.
Yeah.
But I think that's a sort of, you do need other people's encouragement. Like you're not an island. Like I think there's a kind of image of the artist as some kind of individual genius that like never had any help from anyone else, that came up with all this stuff on their own. But like you look at anyone who's successful, and they had hundreds of other incredibly important people around them, and they were inspired and stole in many cases from like the people that they were inspired by. They didn't just come into existence of some virgin birth.
Exactly. Well said, and very good advice too. So thank you very much, Conall, and I look forward to seeing you in more shows and more stand-up and more everything. And more writing as well, and more comedy. It's all very exciting. So thank you very much indeed.
Sweet, thank you. I had a great time.